All right, so that should be recording. I can't see it recording. All right. Great. So yeah, I'll go ahead and get started. So I'm really excited to kick off the AIMOS conference with the first set of lightning talks. Today we've got Annette Brown, Matthew Page, Cooper Smout, and Bob Reed. So it's great to have you all here. I just really quickly give an acknowledgement of country. So I'll start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I am zooming you from today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to the elders past and present. And I'd also like to extend that respect and acknowledgement to the traditional custodians and ancestors of the places that you're zooming in from today. So without further ado, I'll get started and introduce the first speaker today, which is Annette Brown. And she's going to be talking about North-South and gender co-authorship patterns in an international research institution. So Annette, whenever you're ready, if you could turn on your video and share your screen. Fantastic, we can see that.
All right, do you see the full screen or do you see the...
It's in presenter view at the moment.
How about that?
Yeah, perfect.
All right. Well, good day, everyone. I'm pleased to be here with you to present some just quick snippets, early results from some research I'm conducting with my co-author, Ebelechukwu Manye. For me, this is kind of follow-on research to some work that I did a couple years ago, looking at that time at a sample of development impact evaluations and the authorship patterns there. And for those studies in the global health journals, I found that there were roughly equal male-female authorships and authorships from low and middle income countries and high income countries. Again, this was all research conducted about or in low and middle income countries, and only equal authorship between high and low and middle income authors. A lot of others have been conducting similar kinds of bibliometric studies about local authorship and sex of authors. This is a recent study that was also focused on global health for research conducted in low and middle income countries, and they found that almost 30% of their sample of studies did not include at least one low or middle income country author. So we're looking here at a sample of studies conducted by authors that work in our organization in FHI 360. And we're asking a lot of questions about the patterns of authorship because we want to think about a baseline for our own localization agenda. FHI 360 is an implementing partner conducting development programs in the United States, but mostly in low and middle income countries. And we also conduct quite a bit of research, publishing roughly 200 articles in peer-reviewed journals a year. So the population of studies we'll be using for this research are all of those published in 2018 or 2019 with at least one FHI 360 staff author. That doesn't mean that it's all FHI 360 sponsored research. Some of us continue to conduct research from jobs before or with colleagues outside of FHI 360. But what these studies have in common is somebody works at FHI 360. We're extracting from these studies quite a bit of bibliometric data. Two things primarily are looking at local authorship, and the way that we identify that is if at least one of the countries of affiliation of the author matches at least one of the countries of study. We're also extracting information about the number of contributions and the total contribution categories for studies, but I don't have that information for you here today. So if we look at the subsample of our studies that is research conducted in or about lower middle income countries, we have 205 of those articles coded so far. And so far, it's looking better than what the other research shows in that we only have 12% of these studies that have no local author at all. But if we look at all if we look at all the authorships, we see that again, we have about roughly equal authorships between local and non-local authors. But the information is a little more discouraging when we look at first authors and last authors, where the majority are not local authors. We also look at sex. We find that the majority of all authors are female, as well as, and in fact, a greater majority of first authors and last authors. But this information is muted a bit when we recognize that it's not the same for local authors and non-local authors. So you can see for those authors that are not local to the low and middle income countries where the research is being conducted, we have a majority of female authors. But when we look at those authors who are local to where the research is being conducted, we have about roughly equal male and female authors. So this is just the beginning of this research, trying to understand where our organization is in terms of local authorship and inclusion. Some of the recommendations that other research is suggesting, and we are also beginning to think about, are whether there should be local authorship requirements for research conducted in low and middle income countries, and perhaps more importantly, whether we should change what the conditions are for who should be considered and included as an author in a publication. And we've already begun to make some of those changes. Thank you.
Great, that's fantastic, Annette. That was such a comprehensive talk for 5 minutes, so well done.
I didn't know how to stop sharing.
Oh dear, let me see.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Alrighty, so I'll introduce our next speaker. We have Matthew Page up next, and he's going to be talking about frequency and types of data and code availability statements and systematic reviews of interventions. So Matthew looks like he's all set to go, so I'll leave you to it.
Cool, and you can hear me okay?
Yeah, sounds good.
Excellent. Okay, so first of all, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands of which I'm presenting, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and I pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. So I imagine many of you understand that sharing the data files and analytic code that underlie a research project has many benefits. It can allow others to reuse that information to answer questions that weren't addressed by the original authors, or to check for errors that might need to be rectified. And as a way to help prompt researchers to start increasing the rates at which they share such materials, journals are increasingly asking them to include data and code availability statements, in which the authors indicate whether the data or code used in their study are available, and if so, where it can be accessed. But it was unclear to us to what extent systematic review authors, particularly those who look at aggregate data from studies, how often they include such a statement in their reviews and what types of things they report in these statements. So our objective in this mini study was to estimate the frequency of data and code availability statements in a random sample of systematic reviews of the effects of interventions, and to summarize the content of the statements. And so this was taken as part of a larger study, which we called the Reprise study. And what we looked at was a random sample of 300 systematic reviews with meta-analysis of aggregate data from primary studies that were evaluating the effects of a health, social, behavioral, or educational intervention, and that were indexed during a 4-week period at the end of 2020. We collected a whole range of information from these reviews, which we'll be reporting elsewhere, but today I'm just focusing on the existence and content of the data and code availability statements. So we extracted any of these statements that we found in the review, and then used an inductive coding process to classify the content of them. So one author read each statement to derive a relevant code, and another independently classified the statements using the codes that were originally populated or derived their own relevant code, and then resolved any discrepancies via discussion. So first off, how often do they appear in these reviews? So in these 300 reviews from late 2020, 29% included a data availability statement, none included just a code availability statement, but 2% included both a data and code availability statement. Of the 93 data availability statements, we found that 13% stated that the data files underlying the systematic review were publicly available and provided a link to those files. 42% stated that the data are available upon request, and around 40%, though, surprisingly to us, implied that data sharing is not applicable to systematic reviews. I'll give you some examples of the things they said. So some people stated, this paper is a review and the data are from published literature. It is valid, which is quite a defensive statement, but not really a revealing of why they're not sharing the information in their review. Others stated that the studies were available online, I guess indicating people should go and try and access it themselves. In about 10%, the authors stated no data were used to support this study, which doesn't make any sense given that all of these 300 reviews included a meta-analysis of data from studies. And around 20% stated that all data used in this study are included in this article. I'm assuming what they mean by that is that they've presented data in tables or figures, but it's not unusual to come across forest plots of presenting the results of meta-analyses that look like this, which, as my colleague Simon Turner pointed out, is not really helpful for those who want to actually make use of that information and extract it from these figures. So we recently released the PRISMA 2020 statement earlier this year, which the final item in the statement recommends people include a data and code availability statement in their review. And we indicate in that document that sharing an editable, reusable file, such as a CSV or RevMan file that contains your aggregate data that you include in meta-analysis can better help facilitate reuse in updates, inclusion of your review and guidelines, or in replications of reviews. And if you've used analytic code such as in software such as R or Stata that you are able to share, then sharing it will allow others to understand more about what you did in your analysis than how you may summarize it in the report. So in conclusion, data and code availability statements currently appear infrequently in review manuscripts. And those who do provide a statement, many often authors do incorrectly imply that data sharing is not applicable to their reviews, which I find somewhat ironic because for many years, systematic review authors have been rightfully so complaining about the lack of transparency in primary studies for which they're trying to synthesize. But I think we should be holding ourselves to the same standard. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Matt. That was another fantastic 5-minute lightning talk. It looks like Cooper is ready to go, so I'll quickly introduce Cooper Smout, who'll be talking about creating a sustained movement for cultural change in academia. So Cooper, whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, sounds good.
You can? Okay, cool. And my slides should be up. Just let me know if there's any troubles. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to give this lightning talk. I'll be giving another talk, just an update on Project Free Our Knowledge. I think this is the 3rd time I've presented this at AIMOS. So this time, for those that aren't too familiar with the project, I'll give a quick overview, but then also want to focus on what the longer term vision is for this project, because I don't think I've made that so clear previously. So basically the premise for this project is the idea that we are trapped in a collective action problem in academia. We all know there's much better ways that we could be doing things, but at the individual level, there's these incentives and pressures to keep maintaining the status quo. And so if we look at this diagram that Brian Nosek created about culture change in science, it's pretty clear that we're stuck at this 3rd tier because we've got plenty of infrastructure and user-friendly interfaces to be doing open science, but the problem is trying to get people to actually use and adopt these systems. And we also know that this isn't really an attitude problem. So we know that there's high rates of support for open science practices like open access and open data, but when it comes to actually doing it, there's much lower rates of adoption. And for the psychologists out there, this is pretty similar to a prisoner's dilemma, except in that experiment, the prisoners aren't allowed to talk to each other. But in academia, of course, we could communicate our intentions to act differently and act on them together. And so this concept has been successful in other fields like economics and political spheres, using platforms that are known as conditional pledge platforms. And probably the most common is Kickstarter. And the idea is basically to get people to agree beforehand to take action. And then once you get a critical mass of support for the action, everybody takes action together and therefore protects everyone as they change culture. And so all Free Our Knowledge is trying to do is bring this same approach that's proven effective elsewhere into academia. So the way it works is that anyone can propose a campaign, and this could be to support any kind of open science behavior, like publishing a preprint, sharing data, and so forth. And once we've developed that campaign, we put it on the website and put it out to the crowd. And this is the point at which researchers around the world can pledge to act if and when we reach that threshold of support. And then hopefully we reach that threshold of support and everyone takes action together. Since the last talk, I believe, yeah, I've done a lot of work on the back end of this project. So now anyone can propose and develop a campaign using GitHub. And we're using the issues feature in GitHub to do that. And using this feature, we've got a couple of new campaigns that I'm really excited about. So the first is called Publish Your Reviews, and we're developing this with ASAP Bio. And the basic idea is to get people, when they review a paper that's already a preprint, to then post that preprint or attach it in some way using one of any number of the preprint review platforms that are out there. And another campaign that we're developing right now and just submitted a paper on is called the Open Code Pledge. And this came out of the OHBM Brain Hack meeting. And basically this is just asking people to share their code for every paper they publish once some critical mass of support is met. And of course, we're open to suggestions, proposals, ideas, and you can put any ideas that you have for campaigns on our GitHub repository. And so these are some of our older campaigns that are still live. There's a pre-registration pledge, which is to pre-register a single study once 100 people in your field have taken that pledge. And also there's a number of open access pledges that you can take. So this is the longer term vision that I don't think I've outlined very clearly before. The basic idea is not just to do, well, I guess when you look at previous pledge initiatives, they tend to be standalone initiatives. So cost of knowledge, the peer reviewers open initiative, like these have had effect and they've affected the system and created change in various ways, but they tend to be standalone and don't carry on the momentum. And so the vision for Free Our Knowledge is to try and create this generic platform where we can create replicable processes, analyze the outcomes, and work out what strategies are working moving forward. And so the basic idea here, you can see in this diagram, is that at the moment, there's a number of people who might be interested in sharing code, for example, but not willing to do so because it's not a cultural norm yet. And the idea is that by using this ambassador network that we're developing with Free Our Knowledge, we can reach out to those people, show them that they're not alone. And then once we reach a critical mass of support, all take action together. And then of course, this is just one campaign. We can then learn what happened in that campaign, figure out what was effective, and take those strategies forward using these replicable processes we're developing on GitHub. And so the idea would then be at some future point, we can create a campaign that has a really large threshold. And if we can get enough people to support this, then we can kickstart that change and make it the behavioral norm in a particular community. So I just wanted to get that out there. That's kind of the longer term vision for I'm hoping this project will go. And here are some various ways you can get in touch. And I'd like to thank you for listening and thank everyone who's been involved in this project today. Cheers.
Thanks so much, Cooper. That was yet again another fantastic talk, and it looks like a really cool project too. So we're going to move on to our final lightning talk speaker now. I'll just let you know, if you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat and we will try to get to them in the last 5 or so minutes that we have left. So without further ado, I will introduce Bob Reed, who's going to be talking about why aren't replications cited more? Why don't we just ask? So Bob, whenever you're ready, feel free to pop on your camera and share your screen. You can see a screen.
All right, you can see a screen, is that good?
Yeah, perfect.
All right, well, not quite perfect because I can't get my slides to progress. So let me go ahead and, oh, okay, there we go. All right, so my name is Bob Reed. So thank you very much for allowing me to be a part of this. I'm from the University of Canterbury, and I'm also associated with a research group there, a meta science research group called UC Meta. And my talk today is why aren't replications cited? Why don't we just ask? And what I'm going to do is give 2 basic facts and then pitch an idea. So here's my first fact. First fact is that replications are not published very frequently. So this is a time series graph of replications published in economics journals by year. And you might look at that and be really optimistic and say, wow, they're really taking off. But that would be a misread of this graph. There's about 10,000 articles published every year in economics journals and Web of Science. And so you'll see that in no year have we ever got more than 100 replications. So that's a minuscule percent. So replications are not published very much. That's the first fact. Second fact is they're not cited as much as original research. That's a problem because if replications aren't cited, journals will not be very excited about publishing them, and researchers will not be motivated to write them. So the issue of citing replications, I think, is a really important one, and the key, perhaps, to getting replications to be more normative. So what I want to do is pitch an idea, and most of the people who give lightning talks are giving or pitching ideas from their research. And so what I'm doing here is I'm pitching an idea that I hope other people will do. And so my idea is, let's try and find out why people don't cite replications or don't cite them very frequently. And there's a lot of reasons you can come up with, right? Could be they're just unaware. You know, the original paper is a famous paper, somebody comes along and replicates it, but it gets published in a B or C level journal, nobody is aware of it. That's one possibility. Another possibility is the replication comes out in a low ranked journal. And, you know, you write your paper, you want to impress the reviewers by how everybody at top ranked journals are doing what you're doing. And you don't want to lower the quality of your references by adding a low ranked journal on there. That's a possibility. Another possibility is, well, you cited the original study because that's related to what you're doing. Maybe a reviewer is going to be, was an author of that original study. And if you cited a replication that refuted the original study, maybe that original author who is your reviewer doesn't want to see your paper in print, so he rejects your paper. And just to be on the safe side, you don't mention the replication in your paper. And of course, there's other reasons as well. So what can we do about this? Well, first is getting a list of replication studies. And I think the best site for that is a site called Replication Wiki, which I have nothing to do with, but it's a very, very good site. A little hard to navigate. And so we have a site at Replication Network that lists in a publicly accessible Google Sheet as many replication studies as we can. We got currently 508 replication studies there that can be downloaded. You can take those and then you can match each of those replication studies with the original one. And we've got all those files. So every single replication study, we've got the original that goes with that. And now you've got the originals. And then what you do is you go ahead and you look at the papers that are citing the original, but have not cited the replication. And then you contact those people and you say, hey, why didn't you cite the replication study? And you ask them. So I think it's really important that we try to figure out why it is people don't cite replication studies. And you might say, this is such a great idea, Bob, why don't you do it? And that's a very legitimate point. I think to do this right, you've got to have some skills in doing your survey, both sampling skills and knowing how to ask nuanced questions so your results are legitimate. And frankly, that's just not a set of skills that I or my colleagues have. So I'd like to pitch it out to somebody else. However, we are really happy to help. We've got data, we've got all these replication studies, we've got data on the original authors, we can provide logistical help. I think it's a really important question. And why do it? Because I think the fact that replications are not being cited is a real hindrance to having an influence in the discipline. So how do you fix it? Well, we don't know because we don't know what the problem is. So if we can figure out what the problem is, perhaps we can figure out a fix. And that is the end of my talk. Thank you.
All right, another fantastic talk. Thank you so much, Bob. It was super interesting. I'll wait for some questions to trail in. Feel free to raise your hand as well if you'd like to ask a question. We've only got a couple minutes left. So if no one has a question, I might start by asking Bob a question, if that's okay. Bob, what would you hypothesize as maybe the biggest reason that people don't cite replications? Like, what do you think they would respond to you, at least, like own up to, as to why they don't cite replications?
My guess would be, although based on very little evidence, is that people are not aware that replications are out there. But that itself, the awareness is endogenous, right? So if you really want to find out, you could find out. It's not that hard. But I think it's a combination of, at the outset, not being aware, but underneath that, perhaps not really having much interest in being aware.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And I can see how your work would, or your ideas here would help resolve that. Do we have any more questions in the last few minutes? Do any of the panelists have a question for each other? Annette, do you want to turn off your mic and discuss the question in the chat?
Sure, I was just going to say, look, I agree, but I think part of the endogeneity is even when they know there's a replication, if somebody wants to cite a study because they want to say, you know, that this study has shown something to be the case, then they don't want to go and find the replication that may say the opposite. So I think there's even sometimes when they know there's a replication, they choose not to cite it.
Bob, do you have any response to that?
Yeah, I mean, that could be. On the other hand, I think when people cite papers, they typically are not citing a paper that says, I am doing exactly what somebody else did. And so, you know, what that person did is completely consistent with what I'm doing. Typically, they cite papers that say, hey, there's some controversy out there in the field, and there's some unfilled gaps in the literature, and I'm going to fill them in. So, you know, so a very legitimate thing is to say, you know, author A found this, author B found the opposite of this. I'm going to come in and help resolve this issue. So that, well, I agree that's a possibility. It's not clear to me. That's the explanation, which again is, I'd really love to get all those people together in a room and be able to ask them the question, why didn't you do this?
Right, but sometimes you're not citing the, so you're talking about when you're citing the literature to which you're contributing. But sometimes, for example, you might be citing studies that support the theory of change that you're testing. So you actually want the evidence to point in a certain direction because you're citing evidence that may be telling the story that leads you up to that literature, where then you hope that there's an open question that you can contribute the answer to. So I think, you know, I think it comes down to people are citing papers for a variety of different reasons. And you're right. If it's, I'm contributing to this literature and see, we don't know the answer yet because this study said this and the replication study said something slightly different, then that should actually, as you said, help tell the story why we need more research. But sometimes people are citing papers because they want to have evidence that points in a certain direction.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And it all comes back to, well, at the end of the day, we just don't really know. You know, all these are no doubt describe some subsets of authors, but how big those subsets are is the question. And I love the point that Jason just made here that, you know, and this is a fact that, you know, retracted papers oftentimes still get cited and sometimes quite heavily. So there's a whole interesting research area here on citations.
Yeah, thanks so much, you guys, for some interesting conversations, and thanks for engaging. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We've got about a half-hour break, but at 12 p.m, Bob's actually hosting a discussion section. So feel free to join that. The link is up on the Amos schedule website. And yeah, with that, I think I'll end the lightning talk session. So if everyone can join me in thanking our presenters today, done a wonderful job, and I've been grateful to host this session. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.